speech, Professor Wang Yijun, the chair of the association.
Good morning.
Morning.
Director Lin, Professor Franke, and also colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. So for this session, I'm going to introduce to you Professor William Franke. And also, Professor William Franke is giving a speech, keynote speech for today. So Professor Franke is a philosopher of the humanities and a professor of comparative literature at Vanderbilt University. He has been professor of philosophy at the University of Macau, Fulbright University of Salzburg, the distinguished chair of intercultural theology and the study of religion. His books has been published by numerous university presses. For example, like University Presses of Chicago, Stanford, Notre Dame, Northwestern, Ohio State, and also the State University of New York. Professor Franke's most recent critical theory book is entitled The Theology of Literature. The subtitle is The Bible as Revelation in the Tradition of the Humanities. It follows up on books tracing prophetic poetry from Homer and Virgil to Dante, and then forward to history from Dante through Chaucer, Milton, etc. And also, Professor Franke also developed what he calls a philosophy of the unsayable, right? The philosophy of the unsayable, reconstructing the apophatic tradition of the discourse on what cannot be said. This, of course, is a book published with 2 volumes. And also for today, his speech is, this is a long title. So from Blake's eternal great humanity, divine, to Confucian, 君子, to consummate humanity. So let's welcome Professor Franke.
Thank you very much. 大家好. And thank you for this wonderful topic. I want to thank the whole committee, Wang, Zhao Shou, Professor Lin, Brian Reynolds, for really producing an occasion with an absolutely inspired topic that I want very much to speak to. This between humanity and divinity in literature, art, religion, and culture. In some sense, that says it all. But I really want to single out the very first word as in some ways the most pregnant of all, between. I want to really be speaking from beginning to end here about the between, speaking in the between. The between is a magical or a miraculous place because it does not require presupposing or positing the things it is between. Humanity and divinity are both besieged and threatened species today, especially in the academic world. Many deny that they exist at all in the age of the post-human. Not to mention the death of God. But the ways we relate to them and are impinged on by our imaginations of what they could be are very real indeed. It's in this between that we are free to explore all that humanity and divinity have meant and can be across cultures and in our own global predicament today. So I think that we're always building bridges between worlds that exist really not necessarily in themselves, but in the transition and the bridges that we inhabit, especially as scholars and researchers in the humanities, in literature, art, religion, and culture. So I'm going to emphasize this word between and suggest how humanity and divinity can be experienced only in this between. And the vast traditions, humanistic and religious alike, in both Eastern and Western cultures, inhabit this between and define images of humanity and divinity, always only in at least implicit relation to one another. Historically and anthropologically considered, humanity has always understood and defined itself in relation to some conception of divinity, and therefore of the unknown. Humanity, no less than divinity, is indefinable and unknowable in itself. We don't really know what humanity is. We know aspects of it. We have all of our sciences to give us some knowledge of corporeal aspects, psychological aspects. The human, as such, is one of these ineffable ideas like divinity. And the way of thinking about both that I want to share with you, which I call apophatic, which simply means negative. It's a way of thinking from what is not, starting really from what is not given as such positively, like divinity, or like humanity. Always acknowledging the presence of that ineffable, infinite all. It's always there in every particular individual that we encounter, that we experience, that we can say something about and describe. Yes, but that's never the whole. That individual is part of this all which escapes our conceptual definitions. And that is what we as humanities scholars tune into, to try to interpret the particular in relation with the larger contexts. Actually, the infinite unfolding context, there's always a context for every context. We never get to the end of it. And that's why we have to acknowledge this unknowable infinite that is always already there in the center of whatever we're studying, if we don't want to blind ourselves and focus simply on a positively defined object, which we actually have to do for scientific method. But in humanities, we need to remain open and sensitive to the larger whole that is not encompassable by our thought and concepts. This is more fundamental than any known quantities of whatever type pertaining to defined entities. So humanity is known only in relation to divinity, which is a great unknown, and the unknown is always already there in the midst, at and as the origin of the known. Realizing this changes everything and revolutionizes our understanding of ourselves and of culture, religion, art, literature, etc. I consider this to be a theological viewpoint, or more precisely, a negative theological, or apophatic, that word negative once again, that places or recognizes the unknowable mystery at the center of all our knowing. All we know depends on what we don't know. Now I want to develop this idea in a comparative approach, because the fundamental unknowability that we are always oriented by as human beings, and in knowing anything as human beings, if we don't simply abstract to pure formalistic scientific conceptualities, this fundamental unknowability is crucial to Socrates at a certain origin for Western philosophical thinking, and also to Taoism, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi. I want to set them up in parallel as teaching us the way of unknowing. Socrates is, of course, proverbial for having known nothing. His wisdom was to know that he didn't know. He had heard from the oracle at Delphi that he was the wisest of men. The Pythian priestess bore testimony when she gave Chaerephon, the famous response of all living men, Socrates most wise. And this is the form of the oracle transmitted by Diogenes Laertius in the Lives and Opinions of the Eminent Philosophers. And that's really in the 3rd century AD. But 600 years earlier, with Plato's Apology, we have Socrates telling this story of how he received this news when he was 40 years old. He's about 70 at the time of his trial before the Athenians, that is recounted by Plato in the Apology. And here he says how Chaerephon, a friend of his, but a very impetuous fellow, had the impudence to ask the oracle, the Apollo, the god Apollo at Delphi, is anyone wiser than Socrates? And we get this answer, no, Socrates is the wisest of men. Socrates couldn't believe that. That can't be true. He knew he could not be the wisest of men, and he reflected on that. And he began to get the idea that what the oracle meant is that maybe Socrates is wisest only because he knows that he's not wise. He went around questioning some of the prominent and the reputed sages of the day, and many of them were politicians. And he found that the difference is that they do not know, that they are ignorant, as he did. So that is, I think, a powerful exemplar at the origin of Western tradition of this kind of apophatic, unknowing knowing. And also, Socrates' unknowing harbors a kind of normativity, right? It's not simply not knowing, but that becomes the key to genuine questioning engagement such as we find throughout the Socratic dialogues, and really the beginning of genuine philosophy. And it enables Socrates to critique all those who normally pass for wise. Now, there's a similar recognition of the overarching priority of unknowing in our human condition in Chuang-Tzu. It's expressed in terms recalling Socratic wisdom, that is for us, recalling Socratic wisdom by Chuang-Tzu's famous aphorism, "Those who realize their folly are not true fools." Just like Socrates, if you realize that you don't know, well, that is the beginning of knowledge. At the deepest level, Chuang-Tzu and Socrates alike knew only that they knew nothing. For both, actual knowing is always only in a kind of critique or negation of apparent or presumed knowledge. And this is why, in a much quoted formulation, Chuang-Tzu can say, "Not knowing is profound, knowing is superficial." Now, for both Chuang-Tzu and Socrates, the knowing of our unknowing proves to be the highest wisdom. Positive knowledge is reserved for the gods, or for heaven, Tian, which means that it is relegated to the unknown, whereas what seems to be knowable, the human, cannot be known except in relation to this unknown other, the mysterious and inaccessible, or at least unencompassable, incomprehensible realm of heaven, the divine, divinities. I think Chuang-Tzu's crucial statement on this issue, describing our predicament of unknowing, it's in chapter 6 of the Chuang-Tzu. I quote, "To understand what is done by heaven, and also what is to be done by man, that is the utmost. However, there is a problem here. For our understanding can be in the right only by virtue of a relation of dependence on something, and what it depends on is always peculiarly unfixed. So how could I know whether what I call heavenly is not really the human? How could I know whether what I call the human is not really the heavenly?" This view, namely that everything is known only with reference to and in relation to the unknown or unfixed, is opposed to what have become our typical assumptions in the modern secular scientific age. Instead of starting from what seems to be concretely evident before us, Chuang-Tzu acknowledges that all our knowledge is leveraged from the unknown, and not founded on the positively known. The very idea of the positively known, of the certainty of immediate, discrete, empirical givens, depends on the heavenly, whatever that is. And so on something ungraspably out of reach for finite human knowing. Now, this pattern of thought is already sketched in Chuang-Tzu's own source, really, the Tao Li Ching. Everything depends on a universal, all, which is nothing, nothing that can be thought or grasped. The way, Dao Ke, Dao Fei Chang Dao. The way that can be said is not the everlasting way. A similar dependence of all on an unsayable one obtains in the metaphysical vision of Plato's Parmenides. We're in the 5th century, I think, in either case here, or around the turn from the 5th to the 6th, probably, for Lao Tzu. These two source texts found the vast traditions of Taoism and Platonism, respectively. Considering them in parallel, as I'm doing, might be challenged on grounds that the Chinese tradition is not metaphysical and has no conception of transcendence. This is the great debate about whether this other, heaven, is another world, a metaphysical reality, or must be understood as purely immanent. That was the consensus of scholars for a very long time, and it's been a very polemical and insistently argued position by scholars such as Roger Ames and David Hall, or A.C. Graham, in whose translation I just quoted Chuang-Tzu a moment ago. Now, I want to treat this debate as an example of intercultural critique between East and West, as I do in this book, Apophatic Paths from Europe to China. The issue. And I thought I had it with me here. What I want to try to suggest about this debate, which I think brings out very well the between different cultures, between disciplines, poetry and theology, between humanity and divinity. I want to place us between all of these poles, these binary opposites. That, I think, is a very characteristically and acknowledged, universally acknowledged characteristic of Chinese thinking. I believe that we can undo the standoff between those who deny transcendence to classical Chinese thought and those who assert it, who are growing in number among contemporary scholars. If we understand transcendence apophatically, as what cannot be defined, of course, there's an opening to the unknown in Taoist tradition. I think what the gainsayers are arguing against transcendence, of course, it cannot be defined. That's really the point. It's also the point in Western apophatic thinking, even in Plato's thinking, the good beyond being, and the one that cannot be said. I would like to set up Platonism and Taoism in parallel with each other by moving forward in history to the moment of Neoplatonism, which begins really with Plotinus. We're in the 3rd century, 205 to 270 are his dates. And this is contemporary with Wang Bi, the Taoist metaphysician, I believe 226 to 249, the exact contemporaries. And it's also significant, I believe, that Wang Bi is writing just after the fall of the Han Empire, right? It's that 220 Western Han. It is a period of coming apart where hegemonic discourses as well are faltering. This is the moment when apophasis, the negative, the attention to what cannot be positively asserted, when we come up against the limits of all of our positive discourses, even as society itself comes apart. And this is what Plotinus is beginning to see happening to the Roman Empire. It's going to go on for a while, we would say, 476, the fall of Rome. But it's well underway already a couple of centuries earlier here, in Plotinus' lifetime. I think that their works reflect this moment of apophatic, philosophical, metaphysical reflection, and realizing the way in which it's the nothing and the unknown that really are the only foundation for the systems of philosophy that Taoism and Platonism alike had offered. I think both are offering us an implicitly apophatic metaphysics in which both cultures, East and West, converge. Now, it's only the space between humanity and divinity that allows for representation of either, and indeed for extremely rich forms of figuration producing the arts, literature, and religious rites. We don't know what to say about humanity, well, I was going to say about divinity, except in human anthropomorphizing terms. That's the only way in which we can approach an idea of divinity. I think the converse is true as well, because any way of understanding the human requires idealization, a kind of projection of unity. So is a human being really a unity? Only to the extent that a human being is made in the image of an ideal being, a being that is whole and total. So I think it's only in the between that we're able to define either of these terms and realities. Now, if they are realities, maybe they are irrealities, maybe they are sur-realities. It depends what you want to consider reality, because we could also say they are the true reality. This is what Plato would say. This is what Taoism also wants to say. The true reality is not what we experience phenomenally in the differentiated universe of binary opposites. It's only by actually refocusing, I think, between such oppositions that we're able to see the whole, the infinite, and the ultimately real. And I think that that's very relevant for our humanities studies. That's not just a mystical fringe. I believe it's really at the heart of everything that we, as humanities scholars, are doing. So I wish to expound something of the apophatic or negative logic underlying all of these fields of representations, such as we're engaged in as humanities scholars, moving between divinity and humanity, and to do so in a comparative spirit, ranging across cultures and across periods, from classical, medieval, and Renaissance studies in the West to classical forms of philosophical, religious, and aesthetic thinking in the East, and especially in Chinese tradition. That's my frame. I'm actually going to focus now more on the Western side of this. The title that was mentioned up front, I have not seen that title come back to me actually in any form, so I wasn't expecting it. I began with this idea of talking about Blake's eternal great humanity divine that seems to combine humanity and divinity. But I drifted away from that because it makes an amalgam and doesn't open up so much the space between, which is really what I decided to emphasize. And I was going to compare that with the Junzi, the Confucian ideal of the consummate humanity that actually becomes quasi-divine. But I would really look more to some of the Taoist versions of Zheran, the consummate person, and maybe even the Taoist sage, Shenzhen, as embodying more the spirit of humanity, divinity, in their amphibity, in this ambiguity of always being between one and the other. See, the original idea was then to compare with Zhu Xi, sort of the Chinese Thomas Aquinas systematizing Confucianism and giving us all the positive qualities of the Junzi, who is loyal, obedient, knowledgeable, disciplined. But it's really not those positive qualities that count most for trying to apprehend what is divine about the human being. It's exactly what cannot be positively described and characterized. It's in that open, anonymous space that inhabits all of us, where all of us are like everyone else and infinite. And that, I think, is really much closer to this between space where divinity and humanity are simultaneously active and impinging on one another and revealing themselves to one another. So in this between enables us not to say what divinity and humanity are, but rather to represent one in terms of the other, and at any rate, in terms of something other than themselves. And something that is unknown, ultimately. We reason analogically from given phenomena to what is not given, to the other and as yet ungrasped and undefined. We can speak best about humanity and divinity in an idiom of neither nor. We can only say what they are not because all of their utterances, all of our utterances, are inevitably inadequate to what they really are. Their absolute reality defies statement in language, but we indirectly glimpse them as neither this nor that, neither humanity nor divinity in any definitive terms, but rather something in between. And it's a space that is indirectly revealed by how other realms or registers or realities impinge on it. It is an imaginative construction, this in-between space that our humanities disciplines are figuring in a great variety of ways. This is the realm of philology. And I might have time to try to give some idea of how I consider philology to be a speculative discipline. Really on the model of Giambattista Vico in the 18th century, his Scienza Nuova, where he sets up a dialogue and a mutual project of philosophy and philology. Philology has to work together with philosophy. Philology concentrates on what he calls the certain. And those are discrete objects, the documents that philologists pore over, artifacts dug up by archaeology, discrete concrete facts. Philologists begin with that. But they don't really stand alone, not in terms of their human meaning. And for that, we have to activate this other coordinate of philosophy. And philology becomes speculative by engaging the universal. The philosophical is focused on the true, not on the certain, but on the true. And something is true, not in and of itself, but by its relation to others and to other contexts. That's how you can really show the truth. Of course, not just in a narrow, factual sense of correspondence, but the larger sense of truth as coherence. And ultimately, of all with all, these two axes, philosophy and philology, are brought together. They need each other in the kind of speculative philology practiced by Giambattista Vico that I am evoking here as a kind of a model. And I give some other points of reference for this model further on. Now, I'd like to call our attention to another word in this title. Another, I think, extremely significant word. It's the first word in the subtitle, in. Right? Again, one of these little insignificant contentless words that turns out to be in some ways the most significant of all. The in straddles transcendence and immanence. In says both of these conceptually contradictory relations in one breath. It too is a kind of between. In speaking of the relations between humanity and divinity, in connotes immanent transcendence. Right? Divinity is in humanity, it's immanent. But what is in humanity? Well, it's something that stands outside, something that transcends the divine. The in captures the paradox that cuts both ways, of being in and out at the very same time, a kind of inclusive exclusion. How is it possible for the transcendent and holy and spiritual to be present and manifest in material form and in a profane world? That's the mystery. It's the mystery of the incarnation in the Christian religion. I think there are equivalents related to mystery and incarnation in the immanence of Taoist thinking, Confucianism as well, I believe. Now, certainly in Buddhist practice of meditation. And I think that this form of inclusive exclusion between humanity and divinity, and I want to also think of this in terms of the classical and the modern, and the sort of inclusive exclusion between disciplines of literature, religion, art, philosophy, and even science. They require all of these betweens, or relations of in, to be thought apophatically, with an allowance for and even concentration on what escapes from thinking. We have to think about what we cannot think in all of these relations that are defined by the paradoxical and in some ways impossible in. What is thought in such thinking is thought as unthinkable. And this makes the unthinkable and unsayable the keys to any comprehensive thinking and discourse on these subjects.